If you're a current or aspiring medical student, then in the future you're going to have to choose which hospital or hospital network that you want to work within. This can be quite an important decision, as the relationships that you build early in your career may be essential for obtaining jobs later down the road, since the medical profession, like any other profession, is not immune to nepotism. For us final year medical students across the country, this preferencing process just concluded on the 9th of June 2022, and we're in the nervous waiting period before we'll find out which hospital we'll be working at in 2023. So I wanted to make a video sharing a little bit about what the process of applying for medical internships is like in Australia, as well as dive into how I approached making this decision. But before we start, I just want to apologize in advance if this is a bit of a rambly video, and I also want to apologize if my voice sounds a little off. I've just had, or rather, I've still got COVID at the moment, and I'm still in the 7-day isolation period. Let's not waste any more time, and let's get into the video. As a graduate of an Australian or New Zealand accredited medical school, you're eligible to apply for medical internship in any state across Australia. Domestic graduates, i.e. students who are Australian or New Zealand citizens or permanent residents, are guaranteed an internship offer somewhere in Australia. On the other hand, international students aren't necessarily guaranteed an internship, though from what I've heard, it's rare for them not to get any offers, as there is also the private hospital stream for medical internships. Suffice to say, if you graduated from a medical school in Australia or NZ, then you'll almost certainly have a job for you, provided that you do all the appropriate forms and online modules and you submit your applications appropriately. If you're an IMG, on the other hand, I think it can be quite difficult to get a job as an intern. But in saying that, I don't really know anything about the process, so please don't take my word for it and do your own research. In terms of the application itself, it's a relatively straightforward process, as each state has a guide that you can just follow, which kind of takes you through the steps that you need to apply. Some states, like Victoria, have a merit-based system, meaning that your likelihood of getting a position is dependent on how good your application is, whilst others, like New South Wales, have a random allocation process. For example, in New South Wales, there are 15 networks that you preference in your preferred order, and most people do get their top preference, but if you're one of the unlucky few, you may get one of your last preferences. And you can try to swap, but the hospitals that you've put last are likely the same ones that everyone else has, so rarely will anyone want to swap with you. One tip that I do have if you are a current medical student is that you will need clinical referees for most states' applications. I would highly recommend that at the end of every clinical placement rotation, you ask your supervising consultant doctor whether you can use them as a referee, even if you didn't spend much time with them at all, and get down their mobile number and their email address at the time. Then it won't be so stressful when it comes application time and you've got to ask doctors who you barely remember and who barely remember you if they'll be your referee. Now, there are loads of factors that you may need to weigh up when you're making the decision of which state and which hospital that you want to choose to work in, depending on how much of a planner you are. And I found this decision-making process to be particularly challenging. So I've lived in New South Wales my entire life, and the adventurous part of me was keen to move elsewhere and see what life was like in another state. And initially I wanted to move to like Perth or Adelaide because those seem like the most extreme moves on the other side of the country. But then on the flip side, the homebody part of me was just keen to stay in New South Wales, perhaps even in Newcastle, because it would be much easier and more familiar. However, I ultimately decided that I couldn't stay in Newcastle, even though it might financially make sense. I'd miss out too much on other aspects of life that I wanted to experience. And so in the end, I applied for 3 states: New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. Now, I would have actually applied for WA and Victoria too, but the applications actually take a fair bit of time, and after doing 3, it got to the point where I just ceased doing another application. But I felt that between these 3 states of New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland, I'd have the ability to choose to lean into my adventurous side or my homebody side, if that's what I so desired. So in case it's not clear yet, I haven't actually had to make the decision as to where I want to go, because offers are only released towards the end of July, and it's only after this that I'll have to decide where I want to go. Another thing about the application process is that though you can apply for multiple states, and you may get an offer from each state, you can only accept one position across the country. And once you accept that one, you lose all the other offers that you might have. So at this stage, I have created a preliminary hierarchy of where I want to go, and that is New South Wales, South Australia, and then Queensland. In case I haven't already mentioned it, I want to live in a major city because most of my life I've spent living in smaller towns. So really what I was doing was choosing between Sydney in New South Wales, Adelaide in South Australia, and Brisbane in Queensland. Now, I thought I'd start off by justifying why exactly I put Queensland as my last preference out of the three. And that's primarily for three reasons. One, it uses a merit-based system. Two, my responses to the questions that they asked in the application were quite lackluster. And three, I didn't do a lot of the extra stuff to secure a position, like calling up the hospital and expressing my commitment to living in Brisbane. So I think I've actually got quite a low chance of getting a place in Brisbane. So I thought I'd put it as number 3. Now, choosing between Adelaide and Sydney was much harder. So now I'm going to talk about the factors that I considered in making this decision. So the first thing that I thought I'd start off by talking about is money. Not just salary, but living expenses as well. In terms of salary, in 2019, South Australia interns were paid around 73.4k base, and for New South Wales, it was around 68k as a base salary. For 2023, the New South Wales salary has been advertised at 71.3k, and though the South Australia one hasn't been published yet, it's likely at least $5,000 greater. Now, the second thing to talk about within this kind of money domain is salary packaging. So what is salary packaging or salary sacrificing? Well, basically it's where you can pay for some of your expenses out of your pre-tax income rather than your post-tax income, and therefore, as a result, you derive a small benefit from not having to pay as much tax. But there's a catch when you're working for New South Wales Health that no other state has, and that is that they take 50% of that benefit. It's theft, plain and simple, and unfortunately no one has done anything about it yet. The point of all this to say, along with a lower income in New South Wales, comes hidden ways that the health network will take even more of your income. Now, one of the major expenses that I haven't really had to think about until next year is rent. And I've not really looked into specific prices, but I know that Sydney as a place is more expensive to rent than Adelaide is. So that's just another reason why South Australia financially kind of makes more sense. But this final factor kind of swings it a little bit the other way, and that's travel. So if I was to live in South Australia, then I'd want to travel back to Newcastle a few times a year to visit my family and friends, and with flights costing around $400 return from Adelaide, it would be considerably more expensive than if I was living in Sydney, where it'd just be, half a tank of petrol to drive back home to Newcastle. I'd also have to drive to South Australia to have my car there throughout the whole year, which admittedly would be an enjoyable road trip, but it alone would cost around $250 in petrol, excluding all other expenses. And I likely wouldn't also be able to fit all the YouTube gear that I've got, and so I'd have to organise for that to be shipped to South Australia, and that's just another hassle in terms of time and money. Okay, so that's money. Another important factor is where I see myself living long term. I know I'll end up living in New South Wales long term because I want to be close to my parents and my sister, who are really the only family that I have living in Australia. This effectively means that laying down roots in another state will largely be a waste of time because I know I'll eventually have to uproot and move back to Newcastle or to a nearby city or town. Related to this is proximity to family and friends throughout the next year, and not just long term. Most of my friends will be in New South Wales, with a scattering in other locations across Australia. I don't want to be so far that to visit them means that I need my roster to line up exactly with theirs to justify flying across the country. I'd much prefer to just spontaneously catch up when I've got a day off. The same goes for seeing my sister and my parents. So again, New South Wales makes more sense than South Australia. Okay, I need to apologise in advance if I'm just continuing to get more and more hoarse throughout this next section. Another consideration is what exactly I want to do within medicine. I'm constantly flipping between choosing a lifestyle-oriented specialty like GP or one that I might be more passionate about, like, I don't know, cardiology. I'll probably make a video solely dedicated to this in the future because right now I'm not sure what exactly I want to do. And so I just want to work in a hospital network that gives me as much opportunity as possible. Finally is just other factors relating to Sydney versus Adelaide. 1, traffic. Traffic is definitely better in Adelaide than Sydney. 2 is how much there is to do. And there's probably more to do in Sydney itself, but both are major cities, so they've likely each got enough to do over the space of a year. 3 is whether I want a hospital-based job or not. If I do want to do a hospital-based specialty like cardiology, then building a network in Sydney itself makes sense because I'm more likely to be able to get a job here later in the future if I've already sown the seeds and developed some relationships. And finally is dating. Again, this is going to be a whole separate video, but let me just talk about how dating came into my decision-making process between Sydney and Adelaide. So firstly, my approach to dating is that I'm looking for a future life partner, not something casual. So let's use a scenario where I found this ideal person. We'll call her Lady A in Adelaide and Lady S in Sydney. Now, as I mentioned before, long term, I'm talking like in 10 plus years, I'm going to be needing to live close-ish to my parents to be able to eventually take care of them as they get older. That's absolutely non-negotiable for me. In my analysis, it's a much bigger ask for Lady A to move her entire life from South Australia to Newcastle for me, especially if South Australia is where her family and her friends are. In contrast, Sydney is really not that far from Newcastle, so Lady S would still be close enough to her friends and family if we were to live in Newcastle. Therefore, dating in Sydney is more likely to lead me to a partner who's accepting of moving to Newcastle than someone in Adelaide. And I get it, you're probably thinking, well, that's a bit of an extrapolation, mate, and I probably shouldn't go into this level of planning and overthinking when it comes to, developing relationships. But the way that I see it is that most people aren't intentional enough about the relationships that they're in, especially if they're relationships that they're starting in their later teenage and early 20s. And as a result, they stumble into relationships that aren't actually what they want, but more so a result of convenience. And I guess for me personally, I've just simply recognized what's important to me, and I'm hoping that I can find someone who shares similar values. I'll leave further discussion about the topic to a future video. So, after weighing up all these different factors, I've kind of ultimately decided that if I do get the hospital network that I want to in Sydney, I'll choose that. If I get shafted to Western Sydney, but I get an offer in Adelaide, I'll likely take the Adelaide offer and lean into having an adventurous and fun year before trying to switch back to the hospital network that I want to in Sydney as a resident medical officer. If I get shafted to Western Sydney, but I don't get an Adelaide offer, then I'll just take the job in Western Sydney. I don't think Western Sydney is actually that bad. It's just more so the convenience of living in the city and being able to go to the city whenever you want would just be much easier if I was in a hospital based in the Sydney CBD, or at least around that area. Now, I don't really see any chance that I'll get a Brisbane hospital offer, but if I did, I'd take that over the Western Sydney job. Now, despite everything that I've just said, this entire decision-making process doesn't have to be overly complicated. You can simply choose wherever you want to go, submit an application for that, as well as in your home state as a backup option, and hope for the best. All states, except for New South Wales, have a 1-year contract. So after your internship year, you can just move to a completely new state and hospital. And even with New South Wales, you can just break the contract after a year. It really doesn't matter. But as you can gather from this video, I'm an overanalyzer, and I enjoy the countless hours I spend trying to deduce what location would be best for me. I really hope that you found this video useful. If you did, feel free to share it with someone else who you think might benefit from it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.